Hey, welcome to episode 42 of the Reluctant Leader podcast with Paul Jenkins. That's me, Paul Jenkins, and I'm so excited about this episode. We're going to take a deep dive with Karl Vaters, a seasoned pastor and author, as he challenges the conventional obsession with church size. Y'all, for over 40 years, he's been an advocate for small churches and has worked to redefine success beyond just mere numbers. So whether you're a church leader feeling the pressure to grow or just curious about the future of faith in America, I think you're going to find this interview fascinating and Karl's perspective refreshing. So let's jump into the conversation as we talk about his newest book, De-Sizing the Church, and discuss the heart of what it means to become a healthy congregation. Listen, I'm so honored to have Karl Vaters with us today on the Reluctant Leader podcast. Karl's been in ministry for, I couldn't believe this when I read this on the back of your book, over 40 years as a pastor, speaker. You've written multiple books. We'll get into all that. You host a podcast called the Church Lobby Podcast. And I just have benefited greatly from the work that you do. I don't know if I'm a small church pastor or not. You can help me diagnose that as we get into this interview. But I'm in a small town, and so your writings have just been life for me, and I appreciate. And somehow I feel like you've flown under the radar, right? I mean, when I look at what you do, I'm not trying to pump you up, but you've been doing a lot of things beyond just the influence of the church that you pastored, and so I just thank you for your voice. I felt validated by a lot of things that you said and challenged as well. So I know our listeners may not know who you are as much as I do. So I want to give you a chance just right here at the beginning to share whatever you want to share, your story, your ministry, your favorite hobbies, whatever you want to tell us, just so our leaders can kind of get to know you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think under the radar is a very good way of phrasing all the ministry that I've done for 40 plus years. It was never intended to be under the radar. That's just kind of the way it all worked out. Yeah, I'm actually a third generation pastor. So I was raised in a preacher's home. And my dad was a great pastor of mid-sized to large churches typically. And so when I felt a call into ministry, the image I had in my head was of a mid-sized to large church. That was what I was trained for. That's what I was ready for. I actually just recently wrote an article about the three different lenses through which people see the church. Most people, the typical person in the U.S. is raised in a church of about 350. That's the typical place they go. But the typical church size, the average church size is about 50. But when you talk to Christian influencers and so on, they tend to spend their time with larger churches and pastoring larger churches, and that average is about 850. So you've got people who are called into ministry from a church of 350. They're trained by people who are working in churches averaging 850, but then the marketplace, for lack of a better term, the available positions are in churches of about 50, and there's a disconnect between the three, and that's what happened to me. So I was raised in mid-sized churches, my dad being the pastor, then was trained basically in a mid-sized to large context. And then every position that I was looking for, there are all these little churches. Where did all these little churches come from? So I just thought, well, I'll just go in and I'll, make it not little anymore.
Right.
It was as I was getting into maturity in ministry, it was the heyday of the church growth movement. And, they're touting all of these examples of, hey, we tried this and it worked. We tried this and it worked. Every conference you go to, they got pastor after pastor who, tried these principles and their church wasn't small anymore. And they just didn't work for me. I was able to help churches get healthy and we got a little bit larger, but we never got big. We never got beyond what is defined typically as a small church, to the point where I almost left ministry in frustration and discouragement, not because I needed a big crowd, but because I was told all healthy things grow. And therefore, the reverse of that means if it's not getting bigger, it must not be healthy. So I thought, I must be messing this up somehow. This seems like a great church. It seems like a healthy church. It looks like we're doing great ministry, but it's not getting bigger. So I must just be missing something. And I almost left in frustration until I had to really redefine what was going on and start not with my expectations, but start with the reality of things about church size. And then that turned into the ministry of helping small churches thrive. And it brings me to the wonderful conversation with you today.
Yeah. And I think I think it's in the Grasshopper Myth, was that your first book? It's the first book I
That was my
read.
first book. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, 12
And
years
we
ago.
had just planted our church 2 years prior to that book coming out. And so we actually, um, if you're listening from my church, please give me grace. So when we planted, I was like, hey, we're in a rural town, 16,000 people, and I'm going to be the Stephen Furtick and the next Elevation Church here in a 16,000 city, right? And so we started in a coffee shop that held 100. We had nowhere to put the kids. I mean, we're packed, but it's 100, right? So
Right.
I told our church, God kept us in that coffee shop long enough to kill whatever was driving me to want to be whatever I wanted to be. And so 2 years into it, I was feeling that frustration, and I found the grasshopper myth. And I think I read this in your book. You made a comment, something like, as pastors, we preach to a church that we don't actually have, but the people that are coming to our church are coming because they like the size it is. Like they come because
Yeah.
they like our church, and we're trying to get them to be a different church, a bigger, better, whatever word we put there. And boy, that gave me so much freedom. And I found myself looking at our people differently because of
Mm,
that. Like I wasn't as frustrated with them. I still was frustrated, but it was more internal. And so, yeah, I recognize that struggle. I don't know that if I ever left, but I felt like I was always banging my head against that brick wall of, well, every leader I talk to tells me that I need to try these things. And then when I try them in my context, they don't seem to work. So I must be the
yeah.
problem. And
Yeah.
so, I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, I see the book behind you. You just wrote your new book, Desizing the Church, which, by the way, is fantastic.
Thank you.
Um, I appreciate you your voice has always been gracious. Like some people just rail against a certain size church. So big churches are bad, small churches are good, or vice versa. And
Right.
you kind of dig more into the heart of the leaders of the churches. But before we get to even that, do you mind kind of just describing desizing? I watched one of your interviews with somebody else, and I heard that you invented this word, right? This is
I did. Yeah.
when it
Yeah.
makes it to the dictionary, they're going to have Karl Vaters next to it, right?
Yeah, if it ever does. No, it's interesting because grasshopper myth too. That's a term that I made up for my first book. So I've created two words or two terms at least, and both of which I put on the covers of books. So if it's on the cover of a book, it has to be a real word now, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
every
it's
every
real.
word
It's
every
legit.
word was made up by somebody. So,
That's right.
uh, yeah. So I had this idea, and I tried to come up with. Basically, it was a way of trying to figure out how to have a concise title. And any title that I had using existing terminology just ended up being too long and unwieldy. And so it was about size. And so basically, yeah, I made up the term desizing. And first of all, what it's not, desizing is not downsizing. I don't think churches should be small. I think small churches can be great. And that's a very different lens
Hmm.
than to look through. So this is not about churches needing to be small. They don't need to be small. So it's not downsizing. And secondly, desizing is not right sizing. There is no universal right size for a church. There's some people who are convinced that a certain size is what it ought to be. But I've never ascribed to that because I've been in great churches of all sizes, which is why, as you mentioned earlier kindly, I try to be gracious to churches of all sizes because I've benefited from churches of all sizes. So
Right.
it's not either of those. So what it is, it's the idea that we've got to use numbers correctly when we're assessing the value of something, particularly in this situation, when we're assessing the value and effectiveness of a church. We've had a full generation, almost two generations now, where we've used numerical increase as not just a way of measuring church success and effectiveness, but often as the only way of measuring church health and effectiveness.
Right.
And desizing means let's not do that anymore. Uh, let's use numbers where my numbers are appropriate, but let's remove size and especially size comparisons as a primary factor by which we judge the health and effectiveness of a church.
Yeah. That's so good. It's so needed. You also talk about bigness. Is that another word you
Yeah.
made up? You're just
Yeah,
making up
maybe.
words left and right.
Yeah, very, very well could be. But
But
yeah, in fact, when I've said it in interviews, I've had people continue on with the conversation, and I realized, oh, they think I'm saying business. I need to be very clear in my enunciation.
Yeah. So, but when you talk about bigness in the book, bigness is like you kind of say that's the thing that we're chasing. So
Yeah.
would that kind of be like our, and when I say our, I guess I mean mostly leaders because that's, I mean, I'm speaking from the seat of a pastor. I guess people that attend churches could also be
Hmm.
infatuated with bigness too. But I
Yeah.
think I've seen it. Like I've heard Andy Stanley say this. You know, the only people that like packed houses are the people on the platform. You know, people
Hmm.
in the seats they like some space, some breathing room. They don't want to feel like a number. So we're chasing this what you term bigness, which I think just kind of gets to the heart, right? Like there's something
Yeah.
in me that is craving something that might not actually be good. So as
Yeah.
you've been talking to people, ministering, writing, how how big of a problem do you see pride being in leaders? I'm asking that, and I'm going to be convicted when you start answering it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, let me piggyback on the bigness thing first, and then we'll talk about that pride issue. Yeah, again, yeah, I might have made up the term bigness, but the idea is big isn't a problem and size isn't a problem, but an obsession with getting bigger is a problem.
mm,
So bigness is a shortened way of saying our obsession with getting bigger.
yeah,
And it causes all kinds of dysfunction. It causes all kinds of problems. And one of them is that it doesn't create pride, but I do believe it attracts pride. So that this whole idea, here's the challenge. If in the last 40 years we've seen a real shift um, in the biggest churches in the U.S. When I was a kid coming up in the 70s, you could drive to a large, well-churched American city and not find a single church of over 1,000.
mm,
There were only statistically there were only 19 mega churches in the country at the time. And for anybody who's my age or older, they can remember back in the 1970s, you had folks like Oral Roberts, Jimmy Swaggart, Jerry Falwell, W.C. Criswell, Rex Humbard, long forgotten Rex Humbard out of Akron,
mhm,
Ohio. But you ran out of them real quickly, and you could go to really large, well-churched American cities, and maybe the biggest church in town is 750, 800 people, and that was it. And so
right,
when the biggest church in town is that big, and the average size church at that time was about 150, the difference between the average church and the biggest church in town wasn't all that big, especially if they're in the same denomination. They're singing out of the same hymn book. They're using the same kids and youth programs. They're supporting the same missionaries. And they would literally do pulpit swaps, and nobody could tell the difference between the big church pastor and the small church pastor.
mhm,
But with the advent of the church growth movement and the advent of supersized churches, you now have to have a total, you have to learn new things. Pastoring 750 to 800 people is very different from pastoring 50, but
yeah,
pastoring 7,000 people is another world entirely. And the principles that they had to learn in order to make that functional then started being taught to everybody else. And it could be picked up by a pastor of a church of 500 and go, oh, I can use most of that. But the pastor of a church of 50 is sitting there going, I got nothing. I can't use any of that because it doesn't apply to me whatsoever. And so you
right,
created this haves and have not mentality that I didn't see existing when I was younger anyway. And in talking to my father and even my grandfather back in the day, they never saw that either. That size distinction as a measure of value simply didn't exist, at least not
mhm,
in their world before that. So when you create these really massive platforms, or the way I put it in the book is this: when you create high stages under bright lights with big microphones, you attract people who want to be on a high stage under bright lights with a big microphone. You
mm,
attract narcissists.
mm,
So I don't think it creates narcissists, but it's a narcissist magnet. And
yeah,
so and there are doesn't mean there's a higher percentage of narcissists in big churches than in small churches, because sometimes the narcissist is in the small church wanting to make it become a big stage under bright lights with a
right,
loud microphone. So but it does create this environment where narcissism is rewarded, and where narcissists and where we're attracting them without realizing we are.
yeah. And I know I gave you some questions ahead of time, so I'm just going to ask you one that just I'm just keep thinking about this while you're talking.
Sure.
in our church, I think I mentioned this, I sent you a message on X, or what is formerly Twitter, whatever people call that now, right? So when
I
people would
know.
ask us, and I noticed this was really interesting after the pandemic, pastors, it used to be, hey, how many people are you running? But then when I get together with pastors, it was always, how's your church doing post
Mm,
pandemic? And if I started to say anything other than attendance, they'd be like, no, no, like how many people do you have your church back was basically the question. And
yeah.
I started to wrestle with, it feels like everybody's trying to get back to what we had, as
Oh, yeah.
opposed to, God, is there something you want to do new in the church? And the more that we've leaned into that, I feel like it's the new thing is back to the ancient ways, right? This
Yeah.
is, I don't know if it's a buzzword or if I just, if I'm reading books and they all say the same thing, but like stand at the crossroads, Jeremiah said, and ask, where is the ancient path? And walk in that way, and you'll find rest for your souls. And how do you, there's such a tension there because we still live in America. We're still in a bigger is better culture.
Mhm.
But I'm feeling and sensing this pull back to, and it doesn't mean we have to go back to small. Like you said, it's not a numbers thing. I think God's after the heart of
Yeah.
leaders. Like, are we satisfied with Him and Him alone? And then let Him do the work. He's going to build the church, no matter how poorly we swing the hammer. So how do we, what are you hearing in leaders? What are you sensing in the church right now in America on a heart level? How can we navigate that tension of, well, if healthy things grow, I should see something happening, but I feel like my church is healthy and the growth is coming slower. So
Yeah.
what do we do with that?
Yeah. I'm not the only one to say this, but I don't believe pandemic changed anything, but I do believe that it amplified and accelerated things that were already in the air. So
Yes.
things that were, done with subtle strokes and in pastel colors are now in bold strokes and in primary colors. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you missed it before pandemic, I don't blame you. If you're missing it now, you're just not paying attention.
Yeah, that's good.
And yeah, and one of the things that it's drawing out boldly for us is that cultural Christianity, habitual Christianity, does not have the staying power that it once did. To me, it goes back to Newton's first law of motion, right? An object in motion or an object at rest stays at motion or at rest until it's acted upon by an outside force. And for a lot of people, they were in the habit of going to church. Maybe that was a multi-generational habit for their family. That's just our church. That's just where we go. We've always been involved there. And pandemic stopped that motion. And now that they're not going, once it started up again, they're like, I didn't really miss it because I guess I wasn't really fully engaged anyway.
Mm.
So I'm just not going to go back. I'm fine sitting at home on Sunday morning. What I've noticed in my travel, and I travel a lot. I did 40 conferences last year. I'll be at close to 40 conferences this year. And when I'm traveling, I'm always sitting down and talking. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? And I'm often in small places and in small churches because that's my ministry. And when I do that, what I've noticed is the churches that have not just rebounded, but in fact have thrived post-pandemic, have a couple characteristics that are significantly different from those that haven't. And one of the primary characteristics is this: churches that have survived and thrived post-pandemic are churches that before pandemic had a higher percentage of first generation believers rather than
Mm.
habitually multiple generation believers. And so it's like, which happens to be the congregation that I serve. I came here 31, 32 years ago now, almost. I haven't been the lead pastor for the last 7 years, but I was for 25 years. And in that 25 years, while we didn't grow big, we did grow young. And so
Mm.
that is a real sign of, when people ask me if it's not getting bigger, what's a sign of health? Well, if you're growing younger, that's one of the signs of health. It doesn't have to grow younger in order to be healthy, but that was for us one of the signs of health. And one of the reasons we grew younger was because we were actually reaching out to the community and making first-time converts. And we've got young people, teenagers, who attend church against the wishes of their parents.
Wow.
Now, yeah. So, what if you're coming against the wishes of your parents? A pandemic isn't going to stop you from coming once it starts back up
True.
again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in California, here where we live, it's a post Christian culture. So their friends, even their parents, are against this, and they're going anyway. So they're going to come later. And then that applies to all ages as well. When you live in a post Christian context and you're choosing to go to church, you're already working against the culture. But when you're in maybe where you are, right, Bible Belt in the
Hmm.
South or in the Midwest, and you've got a church culture around you, it's very easy to get caught up in that stream and to think you're a Christian and maybe even be a cultural Christian and maybe even have made a profession of faith. But you don't really have to strengthen your Christian muscles because there's nothing to push back against. Muscle
Right.
strength happens when you have something to push back against.
Yeah.
And then sometimes what we do is we make up enemies. And so here again from California, from this post-Christian context, every once in a while we out here Christians in California scratch our heads when we look at our good friends in the Bible Belt and some of the stuff y'all choose to fight about.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
there's like the biggest denomination in the country right now has a big fight between the far right and the not quite so far right.
Hmm. Yeah.
And we're looking at that and going, really? Because we've got to fight against people who are actually on the left here, and people who
Right.
are
Yeah.
actually not serving Jesus, and people who are actually trying to pass laws that are just abominable. And the wasting energy there just seems, again, but you got to have a different context to see that. So anyway, I
Yeah.
swooped in and out of the answer to that question, but I hope somewhere in there was the answer you were looking for.
Well, I think, uh, I guess if we don't see steps forward, if we don't see have strategy going forward in what is becoming a post-Christian nation, and in the Bible Belt, people want to fight against that, right? Like let's get back to what we were, and it's like, no, I think we might be in Babylon. Let's figure out how to thrive there.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, we got to have steps forward, and I know that you have some of those. I look at the deconstruction, and we can wring our hands and get frustrated with all that, but I see in the desizing book and in some of these calls to return back to tables and dinners, and let's sit around and talk about
Hmm.
life. Like, people that don't follow Jesus are happy to eat burgers and chicken and mashed potatoes and whatever in your context you eat, and talk about life. Everybody's got an opinion,
Yep.
and I, getting back to that, I see such an opportunity. Not that everybody that's under 25 is saying, well, if megachurches will go away, I'll pick a small church of 50 and go to it. But I do think there's an opportunity in the smaller rural setting to have these more natural rhythms in church of, y'all just come over, even if you don't go to church, just come to my house and sit around the table and let's talk. And so we get this chance to
Yeah.
be the church. But to do that, we have to get out of this numbers game. We've got to stop, because
Yeah. I agree.
the church in Acts, they did that. And they grew into a mega church. Thousands were added to the church, but they never had the mentality of, we're doing it to be big. They just wanted
Right.
to share Jesus with people. They just wanted to share a meal and talk
Yeah.
about this man who changed their lives. And so I,
Yeah.
I see
I
so much
think.
hope in your book for that.
Yeah. 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 There's a cultural shift happening, and it's happening outside the church, but it's affecting the church. And one of those shifts is in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we were really, and even into the O's, we were kind of obsessed with our new toys. So we got, all of a sudden, wow, I can just buy a projector and show a movie on a 10-foot screen, whereas before I could only watch it on like a 25-inch TV was considered big when I was a kid, right?
Hmm.
And now we can show it on the wall. And we've got all this technical expertise, and we've got the amps now, and we've got the guitars in church instead of choirs, all of which I love, I still love. But when something new like that comes in, we kind of get obsessed with it. And so it became attractional. It was even used, it was the attractional model. And so these churches were putting on a bigger show with high technical expertise, and people were attracted to it, Christians predominantly, but also some non Christians were like, that's kind of cool. Today,
Yeah.
however, when you talk about the mega church stage show, it has a feeling of, even if it's done well, if you ask the average person if they want to go to the stage show, the Easter production, the whatever at the mega church, they're going to roll their eyes like, oh, that cheesy thing. It's no longer considered a sign of excellence,
Mm.
because they can get that now anywhere. Everybody's got the ability to shine a big screen on the wall or have an 80-inch TV in their house. Everybody's got the best sermons, the best production on their phone without getting out of bed. So production value isn't the attraction that it used to be. So what they don't have, however, is connection. What they don't have is intimacy. What they don't have is trust. So if we can
Yeah.
restore connection and intimacy and trust into their lives by being genuine and authentic, that's what will draw them. My congregation right now is in the middle of a deep dive into the book of Philippians on Sunday, preaching about it. And then on Wednesdays, we're doing a Bible study on it. And our church runs about 150 to 200. So we're on the high end of small now. But last night, there were over 80 members who showed up for a deep dive. I mean, deep, serious dive with workbooks into the book of Philippians. And like, it's not even called a fancy name, it's just called Philippians. Right. And
Yeah.
and split off into tables where on each table there was a table leader who was trained how to walk them through the conversation about the segment of Philippians that we were doing last night. And it
Yeah.
is a young crowd, and over a third of our congregation showed up. And there's no flash, there's no bells, there's no whistles. It's as basic a dive into the text of the book as you can get. And they're
Yeah.
they're absolutely eating it up. They can't get enough of it. That's
Yeah.
that I think is where they will go with us if we lead them there.
Yeah. That's so encouraging. It, we my wife and I have just been on this recent journey looking into neuroscience and just how we're made to be known by the Lord and
Mm-hmm.
we're made to be known by one another. And in that journey, again, from the Bible Belt context, and I read that part where Jesus said to the people, like, "Look away from me," right? They said we've done things like we've done church things, and he says, yeah, you've done all that, but I never knew you, so depart from me, you evildoers. And it just dawned on us that like they weren't sent away because they didn't do good things. They did things that are better than what I'm doing. They were sent
Mm-hmm.
away because they never allowed themselves to be known by him.
Yep.
And I think church people by and large struggle with that because we like to do a lot of good things and stay at a distance. I think what we learned here, at least in our context in the pandemic, was people realized, yeah, I'm really busy doing stuff that I might not want to do anymore, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
also really hungry for relationship. And so now we're coming back into like, how do we figure that out? Like, let's get together and take the mask down and let's know each other. Let's let the Lord know us and let's know each other. And I think that's what this next wave of revival is going to bring are people that say, man, you got to know me and I got to know you and you still like
Yep.
me. You still want to be with me. And that is the gospel,
Yep.
not about the size of the church, or even the name on the church. Is just the people in that building look like Jesus and act like Jesus. And I'm so encouraged to see what comes next. And I'm
Yeah, me
so
too.
thankful for the work that you do and your ministry, your influence. You've been such a breath of fresh air for me. And sometimes like I read some of your stuff and I'm like, ugh, I didn't like that at all because it just really challenges me, like it keeps digging at my heart and like just to kill the pride in me, to not seek the things that our culture tells us that we should seek, and to not settle for what leaders, denominational leaders, church gurus tell us that a successful church should look like, and just to
Mm-hmm.
seek the heart of God for our city. So I appreciate you. Thank you so much, and just for spending
Thank you.
time with us today. I know our people are going to they're going to follow you, find you. Why don't you just tell us all the places that they can do that, and we'll drop it all in the show notes as well.
Sure, yeah. The easiest place to start is my website, karlvaters.com. I put out an article every week by me and by a guest, and then on alternate weeks, either a podcast or a video. So there's plenty of material coming out there. You can subscribe to the free newsletter there, or as long as you spell my name right, you can find me on all of the social media sites.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're not related to Darth Vader at all, right? Because it's spelled differently.
It is, however, we did have a cat for years and we named the cat Darth. So we did
Yes.
have a Darth Vader's in the house. Yes.
Yeah, I'm encouraged by that because it's right there. I mean, it was right there.
Yeah.
You had to do it.
Well, our granddaughter was due on May the 4th. So on a Sunday from the pulpit, I said to my daughter, just so you know, if she's born on May the 4th, you're going to have to give her the middle name Vaders because it's my daughter's, so her last name won't be Vaders. And she kind of gave me that. And then she looked at her husband. They were like, yeah, okay, okay. So, okay. And she was born on May 4th. So her middle name is Vaders because of the May the 4th be with you. So yeah, we just have to lean into it. No, you can't fight it. You just got to lean into it.
Right. You got to go with it. So the Lord has set it
Yeah,
up. You just got to run with it. Yeah.
there
Well,
we
thank
go.
you again for spending time with us today. Yeah. God bless you on all that you're doing. And man, do you have a book you're working on now? I mean, I don't
I
know how
do.
often
Yeah,
it's
I'm
work to
working
come.
on one that will hopefully be out by the end of 2025. And it kind of it'll be my first book for the general Christian audience, not just for church leaders. And
Okay.
it's about decision making and ethics for the Christian life, kind of a continuation of my discipleship and integrity pieces out of Desizing the Church, which we didn't have time to get
Yeah.
into. But what does it look like to be people of integrity, and how do we make decisions in a biblical manner where we're putting the right priorities in the right place?
Yeah. That's so needed right now in the body of Christ. So I can't wait for
Yeah,
that book. So that's
yeah,
2025
thanks.
potentially.
Yeah,
Awesome.
but by the end of the year, hopefully that's the plan. Yep.
Good deal. Well, thanks again for being with us.
You're welcome.
Man, wasn't that refreshing? Just to hear somebody talk about how we can be set free from an obsession with chasing bigness and size in the American church and embracing authenticity. Karl mentioned integrity at the end of that interview, and we didn't really have time to talk about that part of his book. I have no doubt that we will have him back for a future interview. And I'm so thankful that you were with us today. I hope that it's encouraged you. If it has, I would appreciate you reviewing it, leaving me some 5-star reviews. Those are awesome. And sharing this with somebody that you know would benefit from what Karl was talking about. I'm praying for you as you lead people, as you grow in your leadership journey. I want to remind you again that if you'll just give God your yes, He will take care of the rest. I'm Paul Jenkins, and I'm so thankful that you spent this time with me today.